Water is flowing out from under the rock, under the dome of the rock, on the Temple Mount. There's a prophecy in the Bible that this should come to pass in the days of Christ. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me water from the rock.
And JR, this is truly exciting news. I've been following the writings of Gershon Solomon of the Temple Mount Faithful, and on his website we pick up some of his words describing water from the rock. And I'm quoting, according to what we now know, the water is definitely flowing from under the rock. And by the way, parenthetically, there's just one rock that he's talking about. The Arabs on the Temple Mount deny this and have tried to stop the flow by many means, but have not succeeded. What we now know is they are trying to bring in special pumps to stop the flow. In any case, the water continues to flow. Nothing can stop it. Well, Gershon Solomon writes with great authority because he's been trying to rebuild the temple ever since 1967, and he's been right here in the Prophecy in the News studios, and he's a man of faith, JR, for sure.
And he tells us there's water flowing from the rock under the Dome of the Rock. Now, this is a picture of the Temple Mount and the Dome of the Rock there, the Mosque of Omar. Underneath that golden dome is a rock called in Arabic Es-Sakra, the rock. It is the rock that once stood in the Holy of Holies. I'm going to remove this picture now and let you see a scene from inside the Dome of the Rock. This is the dome on the inside, and down under it right here, the magnificent rock whereon Abraham once attempted to sacrifice Isaac. And in the days of Solomon's temple, Solomon put the Ark of the Covenant on this rock. It was in the Holy of Holies. And this is the rock that is presently leaking water. How about that? Here's another picture of the rock you can see right here. This is the west side. This area here has been cut out many centuries ago when a Christian shrine was built on top of this rock. And right here, of course, is the indention where the Ark of the Covenant once stood. And one more picture of the rock, Gary. We have it right here. You can see the west side again. Here is the balustrade, or the fence around it, and you can see the rock up here. On the south side, coming out from under this rock, is water. And the Arabs don't know exactly how to handle it. Gary, this is the first time in history there's been water under this rock.
The first time in recorded history. That has always been dry. Anytime there were ever libations or sacrifices there, the water had to be brought in containers. And this goes back as far in history as you care to check. Gershon Solomon continues. He says, and I'm quoting, "This special news has caused much excitement in Israel. Since the destruction of the Second Temple, the Jewish people have anticipated this event with great desire and prayers. We always knew that this would be one of the signs of the last days for the redemption of Israel, and that the Third Temple is soon to be built, and Mashiach ben David is soon to come." Well, J.R., Mashiach ben David is Messiah, son of David. Now, we know him by a slightly different name.
We have two genealogies, one in Matthew and one in Luke. It takes him right back to David.
Yes.
This, to me, is really fascinating to have an Orthodox Jew, a man who has been in charge of the group rebuilding the tools of the temple, preparing for that day when the temple will be restored and temple worship will be restored. And he is the one who reports on water from under the rock. Now listen to Zechariah chapter 13 and verse 1. "In that day there shall be a fountain opened to the house of David and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin and for uncleanness." Gary, this fountain opened will be in that day. It specifies, for example, in chapter 12, leading up to this verse, he says, "I'll make Jerusalem a cup of trembling to all people round about. They shall be in the siege both against Judah and against Jerusalem." And he goes on then in chapter 14 to show the Messiah touching his feet down on the Mount of Olives. So couched right between, in these three chapters, is this marvelous fountain open to the house of David. And you know, the house of David was the house that Solomon built, the temple itself.
That's absolutely correct. And J.R., what's exciting about this is that the water started to trickle out. We don't know for sure when, but 2-3 years ago, we were hearing reports about complaints coming from the Arab leaders in Jerusalem who were saying the Israelis are trying to flood out our subterranean projects down here, and they're playing tricks on us. They're injecting water down here under the rock, and they'd better quit it. And the Israelis were not doing this. And since that time, the water has gotten to be more and more and more prevalent. And from what Gershon Solomon says, it sounds like now they're bringing in pumps. Yes. Now, when you're talking about pumps, you're talking about quite a bit of water.
I wish we had a picture we could show you here on television. Obviously, this is a video means of communication, but the Arabs have not produced any pictures of this, and they're trying to cover it up.
Well, because they know very well the prophecies. They wouldn't want to see prophecy fulfilled in any way. J.R., Zechariah 14 talks about the Lord coming at the end of the time of Jacob's trouble. And it says, and his feet, now this is Zechariah 14:4, and his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof toward the east and toward the west, and there shall be a very great valley, and half of the mountain shall remove toward the north, half of it toward the south. There are going to be, in those future days, geological cataclysms. And we know that. We take that as a point of faith. But what comes out after that is what's interesting to me.
Yes. And so we have here living water going out from Jerusalem, and it begins as a trickle, and it gets larger and larger and larger. Well, the trickle is there, folks. We live in those days, and it's interesting that Gershon Solomon said that since the destruction of Herod's temple, that's been 2,000 years, the Jewish people have looked forward to that day when water would emerge from under the rock, that would be a sign of the coming of the Messiah.
You know,
so we must be living in those days, Gary.
We must be living in messianic times. Zechariah 14:6 says, and it shall come to pass in that day that the light shall not be clear nor dark, but it shall be one day which shall be known to the Lord, not day nor night, but it shall come to pass that at evening time it shall be light. Sounds kind of like a supernatural move of God there. And it shall be in that day that living waters shall go out from Jerusalem, half of them toward the former sea, and half of them toward the hinder sea. In summer and in winter shall it be. In other words, this is not a seasonal event. This is water that just flows all the time.
Yes. Now, living water means spring water.
Yes.
As opposed to stagnant water, or water, for example, that's caught in cisterns, rainwater. You know, there are a number of cisterns built around the temple site, around on that mountain, to catch rainwater, because during the days of Solomon's temple and also in the days of Herod's temple, there was no well, there was no water available on top of that mountain. They had to catch the water that when it rained. And so they built these huge cisterns and used that water for cleansing off the sacrificial table for the slaughter of the animals. And that's the way they kept the temple clean, and water to use in the mikvahot baptismal pools that were within the temple compound. And so for there to be living water on that mountain today is just really phenomenal. Gary, let's go back and talk about the original water from the rock and how it's a prophecy of what's happening today.
Yes, J.R., this all starts back here in Exodus 17:6, and we have this beautiful picture of the Israelites going through the desert. They're complaining, they're thirsty, and to make a long story short, Exodus 17:6 says, behold, I will stand before thee there upon the rock in Horeb, and thou shalt smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it, that the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. So he struck that rock there at Mount Horeb, and water came out. Everybody had enough to drink. But this is only the beginning, the bare beginning of a long story.
You know, Gary, we've never considered that to be a prophecy before.
Yeah.
But obviously it is, well, let me put it this way. We never considered it to be a prophecy for the second advent of the Savior. We always thought it was a prophecy or looked for it to be a prophecy of the first advent of the Savior, especially the second time Moses was asked to go to the rock, and this time he was supposed to simply ask the rock to bring forth water. And God would have done it.
Yes.
But what happened?
Well, he smote the rock twice. And in doing so, he displeased God. In fact, displeased God gravely.
Yeah.
And JR, that brings us to a break. And when we come back, we've got a lot more.
When Moses smote the rock in Exodus chapter 17, it was a picture of Christ being smitten. The second time Moses was asked to speak to the rock, Gary, that must be a picture of the second advent of Christ.
Well, JR, we have God telling Moses and Aaron to go to the rock and speak to it. He said, take your staff, Moses, take your brother Aaron, go to this rock and speak to it, and water will come forth. And Moses was very angry by the behavior of the people. He had just had it up to here, to use a contemporary expression. So we read in Numbers 20, verse 9 and following, Moses took the rod from before the Lord, as he had commanded him. Moses and Aaron gathered the congregation before the rock, and he said unto them, Hear now, ye rebels, must we fetch you water out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand, and with his rod he smote the rock twice, and the water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their beasts also. But a punishment for Moses came out of this event.
Yes. Moses was not allowed himself to go into the promised land. But you know, it's interesting, Gary, that God allowed him to smite the rock not once, but twice that second time.
That's right.
And so total, 3 times the rock is smitten. Now, the first smiting over in Exodus 17 surely must be a picture of the smiting of Christ at Calvary. But this second time he was asked to speak to the rock, that must surely be a prophecy of the second advent of Christ at the end of days. We're living in that generation, and he goes and he smites the rock twice. Want to speculate on what kind of fulfillment that brought?
Well, there was a sin in the camp. The sin of Israel meant no water. That's what precipitated this whole second occurrence, and why Moses was so angry, because he felt these sinners didn't deserve water. Now, when he smote the rock, figuratively, he was really not striking Messiah. He was striking Israel, I think, his own people, and striking them, punishing them in a way for their sins.
And he smote them twice. Well, I can see the first smiting in the Holocaust of World War II. Is it possible we have another smiting yet in the future?
Well, we do have another terrible time ahead, the time of Jacob's trouble, which would be another smiting of the people.
Wow. Now listen, please, to Ezekiel chapter 47, in case you're wondering about this rock coming, seeping out from under the rock that is under the dome of the rock, this rock that once sat in the Holy of Holies, this rock upon which the Ark of the Covenant once stood. Ezekiel, in chapters 37 and 38, describes the rebirth of Israel and the battle of Gog and Magog. In chapter 40 and 41 and following, he describes the rebuilding of the temple. In chapter 43, he describes the coming of the Messiah. Chapter 47, listen to it. Afterward, he brought me again to the door of the house, this is of the Temple Mount, to the temple. Behold, waters issued out from under the threshold of the house eastward. For the forefront of the house stood toward the east, and the waters came down from under the right side of the house at the south side of the altar. That's on the south side of the rock, the Es Sakra. And that's exactly where, according to Gershom Solomon, the water is emerging today.
Just geographically perfect, the same way it'll be in that day. And by the way, when Ezekiel describes this water, he describes it as starting as a trickle and then getting bigger and bigger.
Yes.
Are we seeing prophecy fulfilled right before our eyes? Is something getting ready to happen?
Well, according to Gershom Solomon and the Jewish theology, okay, they believe that when water emerges from under the rock, that the Messiah is soon to come, and the temple will be rebuilt. Obviously, we've got a temple here when Ezekiel sees the water.
Well, J.R., I'm reading a commentary. This is a Jewish commentary on the book of Ezekiel. And they say this about Ezekiel 47, which you just read. Thus we see that the waters destined to gush from the water gate are really an extension of the modest bottle of water that had been once brought through there for the annual water offering. Small wonder that this water offering was the central point of rejoicing at the drawing of the water, the mighty celebration which took place during the last 6 days of Sukkos, or tabernacles. Mm-hmm. And so they tie this to the festival of the pouring out of the water, Feast of Tabernacles, and also to Isaiah chapter 12, which speaks of the waters of salvation. Isaiah 12, 2 and 3 say, Behold, God is my salvation. I will trust and not be afraid, for the Lord Jehovah is my strength and my song. He has also become my salvation, which is Yeshua. Therefore, with joy shall ye draw water out of the wells of salvation. This has got to be the same water we're talking about.
The wells of Yeshua.
The wells of Yeshua.
Wow, what a way to put it. In chapter 47 of Ezekiel, he goes on to say, Then he brought me out of the way of the gate northward, and led me about the way without the utter gate, by the way that looketh eastward, and behold, there ran out waters on the right side. And when the man that had the line in his hand went forth eastward, he measured 1,000 cubits, and he brought me through the waters were to the ankles. So we have a trickle of water here, just a little bit coming out from under, but obviously it's been building, because by now the Messiah is here and the temple has been rebuilt. He says, Again he measured 1,000 cubits and brought me to the waters were to the knees. Again he measured 1,000 cubits and brought me through, and the waters were to the loins. Afterward he measured another 1,000. It was a river that I could not pass over, for the waters were risen, waters to swim in, a river that could not be passed over. Gary, this is the river that flows down to the waters of the Dead Sea and flushes out that dead water. And Ezekiel here describes, listen to verse 10, It shall come to pass that the fishers shall stand upon it from En-gedi even unto En-eglaim, and there shall be a place to spread forth the nets, and the fish of according to their kinds, as the fish in the great sea. There were saltwater fish and the Dead Sea. Fascinating here that the Dead Sea is going to be brought back to life again by the water from the rock.
Going to be flushed out by the water from the rock. That is not only a geographical picture, it's also a metaphysical picture of what Jesus will do as the water of salvation. You know, we have in John 7:37 this, in the last day, that great day of the feast, Jesus stood and cried. Now, this describes the 6 days of Sukkos, or tabernacles. And on each of those 6 days, there was a festival or a ceremony called the pouring out of the water. The water had to be brought through the water gate by the priests. It was poured out, and a benediction was read. And on the last day, at that time, now this is the Festival of Tabernacles, which, again, the rabbis linked to Ezekiel 47, and Jesus stood up and said, If any man thirst, let him come unto me and drink. He that believeth on me, as the Scripture hath said, out of his belly shall flow rivers of living water. This just ties it all together in a neat package.
It really does, Gary. The exciting thing about all of this is that we are in this day now seeing the beginning of the fulfillment of this prophecy, which says to me Jesus is coming soon. Now, Gary, we have fish being caught in the Dead Sea because the waters empty into the Dead Sea. We have in Zechariah chapter 14 the Mount of Olives splitting in two with an earthquake when Jesus comes back in power and great glory. And the river then flows down through the opening made by the Mount of Olives, goes all the way out to the east to the Jordan River and flushes out the Dead Sea. Fascinating story. Do you remember when we did the story on the Jordan River, how that the life of man is pictured from the waters flowing from Mount Hermon down through Galilee, and that looks like the adolescent period of life, and then flowing down through the difficulties, the snaky flow, you know. And when it gets past Jericho, you know, there's where the Ark of the Covenant entered upon the scene. But the Dead Sea itself is a metaphoric picture of the death and hell and judgment for an unbelieving human race. That's the ultimate destiny of the unsaved man. But here's the waters of salvation flowing down and bringing life.
Bringing life
to man who is headed for hell.
This has to be the time when Jesus returns. It just has to be, because he's the one who promised to bring rivers of living water. You know, the rabbis say this gradual widening of the stream in Ezekiel 47, as the water gets deeper and deeper as it gets further from its source, if we equate our stream with the well of salvation, Isaiah 12, from which the Holy Spirit is to be drawn, this gradual growth of the stream need not surprise us. The further we go, did I turn too many pages? Yes, I did. The further the distance from the source, the greater the need to spread holiness from the temple. So they liken this to the moving of the Spirit in the days of Isaiah.
Wow. And we have this news article from Gershon Solomon that water is now trickling from the rock. We'll be back in just a moment. Notice, please, that Ezekiel describes the Mosque of Omar in chapter 42, and the last verse when he says he measured it by the four sides, had a wall round about. This is the Temple Mount area, 500 reeds long, 500 broad, to make a separation between the sanctuary and the profane place, indicating that when the Jewish sanctuary is restored, the tabernacle of David is set up on the Temple Mount, there's going to be a profane place there just to its south, and a wall built between them. And when the Lord comes in chapter 43, he says that they're setting their threshold by my threshold and their post by my post, and a wall between me and them. So, Gary, it looks like the Mosque of Omar is going to be there with water trickling from it when Jesus comes back.
In some way, and it'll be really interesting to see how it all works out. Well, he's got it under control, J.R.
Yes. The interesting thing about all of this is that there has never been water on the mountain before. In the days of Solomon's temple, in the days of Herod's temple, they had cisterns on top of the mountain. They had to catch rainwater in order to have water up there on the mountain for the sacrifices, for the baptismal pools, for the washings, and there was a lot of blood around there, Gary.
You know, this area we're talking about now that's going to be so filled with water originally started out as a very dry place. It was a threshing floor. And a threshing floor is where you put out your grain to separate it. If there's a little trace of water there, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
So it started as a threshing floor which King David purchased from a Jebusite man there that had owned it for centuries. There was no water there at all, and yet all these prophecies of water are all through the Bible.
Wow. Hey, we live in the last days. This is J.R. Church and Gary Stearman. Until next time, keep looking up.
Prophecy in the News is a viewer-supported ministry sponsored by our many friends across America and in your area. For your gift of $10, you can receive a special edition of our current programs on audio tape. Or for a gift of $20, we'll send you our programs on videotape. For either order, add $3 for shipping and handling, and to order, call the 800 number on your screen right now.